Now, I mentioned that we surveyed 14,000 employees around the world. And I did this in partnership with a leadership firm in the United States called DDI. And this is part of their global leadership forecast that they do. And they looked at the frequency of effective leadership behaviors. And so these are the things that great leaders do. And if you notice, it's easy to do traditional leadership things, like maintaining high trust and confidentiality, sharing why you made a certain decision. These are more traditional aspects of leadership. But look at what's at the very bottom of the list. Showing a willingness to be vulnerable, genuinely acknowledging your failures or shortcomings, inquiring and caring about the well-being of your people. These are things that leaders struggle with the most, vulnerability especially. Leaders around the world are not comfortable with any kind of vulnerability. And it's not even close. I mean, it's way down at the bottom of that list. Now, we tried to look at the frequency of what we call emerging leadership behaviors versus traditional leadership behaviors. So traditional leadership behaviors are things that I talked about. These are things that have always been important in leadership. Maintaining high trust and confidentiality, recognizing your team, sharing your thoughts and rationale for decisions. These are traditional management and leadership attributes. Emerging leadership attributes are things like vulnerability, failures and shortcomings, asking about well-being. These are new emerging things that are happening. So when you look at this chart, that's what that comparison is. And what we notice when we look at this chart is that the more senior you become inside of your organization, the less frequently you are going to practice the emerging leadership behaviors. So the more senior you become, the less likely you are to show any kind of vulnerability. The less likely you are to ask your employees how they're doing. The less likely you are to genuinely talk about failures and mistakes and any shortcomings that you have. And that's very interesting, right? That the more senior you become, the less likely you are to do these things. Now, if we specifically look at showing a willingness to be vulnerable, you can see that the more senior you become, it really drops when you get into a senior leadership role. So it declines gradually, but when you get into that leadership role, it completely just falls off a cliff. And so the interesting question is, why is that the case? Why is that the case? A big part of it is because the more senior you become inside of your organization, the more you think that other people need to trust you, and the less you think that you need to trust others. Because you got into that leadership role, so you assume that as a leader, people have to trust you. Because you worked hard, you're in an executive in a leadership role, so people should have to trust you. But the flip side of that is that because you are in that leadership role, you assume that trust doesn't have to go the other way. And that is a very, very interesting thing that we see in the role of leadership. Now, to kind of illustrate this concept and how things are changing, I like to tell this story of, it's a particular butterfly that we have in the United States. And the story about this butterfly is that in the 90s in Nevada, this butterfly was blossoming and blooming, and there was lots of these types of butterflies everywhere. And then what happened is gradually over time, humans came into the area where this butterfly lived, and humans brought with them cattle, right? Cows and different animals. And these cows and animals came into the area, they brought with them an invasive species of grass. And what happened is that the butterflies were used to one particular type of plant in the area, and then when the cattle and the humans came, the other plant became more invasive and took over. And so the butterflies had to adapt to this new type of plant in the area. They had to adapt to this new type of food, shelter, of where to have their offspring. And then one day, years later, the humans and the cattle went away. And when they went away, this grass that they brought with them died off, and the butterflies were not able to adapt again, and they all died. Now, the story has a happy ending because butterflies from nearby areas were able to come and repopulate the area. But the point of the story is there's a concept in psychology called mismatch theory. And mismatch theory states that attributes and behaviors that were once beneficial to you become detrimental to you when your environment around you suddenly changes. And that's exactly what we're seeing in the world of work. There used to be a time where command and control, not showing emotions, never admitting mistakes, being a really tough boss, where that used to be beneficial to you. We taught that in business. It was what was widely accepted. Even in the United States, there used to be, Fortune magazine used to publish every year America's toughest bosses. And if you made it on the cover of that magazine, it was a badge of honor. And if you worked for that kind of a leader, it was great. And so this was standard, right? I mean, if you interview, I'm sure a lot of the executives at this company who've been there for a while, they will tell you that's how business was. And it was okay, and it was accepted, and everybody did it, and it's how things were done. But if you look at how quickly the environment around us has changed over the past few years, especially post-pandemic, you'll see that those attributes and those behaviors are no longer beneficial to us. Command and control, not showing emotion, not talking about vulnerability, not putting people first. All these things are beneficial to you, but we have to adapt. And so the question that I always ask leaders is, do you want to be like this butterfly that dies off because it's not able to adapt? Or are you willing to make that change? Are you willing to be this different kind of a leader that your employees and that your team and your organization need you to be? So the personal ROI for you as a leader for why you should lead with vulnerability is that it's going to ensure your career and your leadership success. Because if you don't do it, you will go the same way of the butterfly and you will die off. Right? People aren't going to want to work for you. You're not going to have a leadership role inside your company if you don't do this. Now, the second is more kind of the traditional ROI. And so we looked at organizations around the world, and we found that in organizations where leaders lead with vulnerability always, when appropriate, those organizations, the leaders in those companies are perceived as being higher quality. So when you lead with vulnerability when appropriate, people view you as a better leader. And it's a big gap between not at all or rarely versus always. It's a 30% gap. So the more that you can lead with vulnerability when appropriate, the more your people are going to look at you as being a high-quality leader. We also looked at some more traditional business metrics as far as the ROI of leading with vulnerability. And you can see that in these organizations, employees are almost twice as likely to innovate when you lead with vulnerability. 5 times more likely to trust their leader, over 5 times more likely. These are organizations that are able to foster a more inclusive environment. They're able to lead virtual teams more effectively. These are teams that are more engaged at work. So there's ROI not just in terms of what it means for you as a leader for your career, but also in terms of the benefit that you're going to have to the business. And again, remember, we're not just talking about sharing your feelings and emotions and weaknesses and problems. I don't think that leaders should just be vulnerable. We're talking about leading with vulnerability, competence and connection, leadership and vulnerability, not just vulnerability on its own.